Janet, Janet. Janet, 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 Janet.
I like that. It's going to be my new theme song.
Janet, 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 Batman.
November 12th, 1957. It is Tuesday. A Tuesday that warrants the presence of Patrick's policeman standing on his doorstep. As he walks in, he rushes to the spare bedroom that has been the studio without so much of an acknowledgement of his absence. 'Cause child, you've been gone for 3 weeks. What is it giving? What's going on? It's Tuesday, right? He says. If I was Patrick, I would have been like, excuse you? Not you coming in here acting like everything is everything. Given the circumstance, I guess Patrick had no right to ask. His policeman starts badgering him about why he invited him in the first place. What were his intentions? Was this all a setup? He says he can't come see him anymore, and the more he talks, he grows more and more angry. Patrick, trying to remain calm, speaks softly and pretty much tells some truths and some not so truths, in my opinion. Says his policeman is there because he wants to be. True. That he had intentions to draw him and that he still could. Untrue. He definitely plotted this from the start, but continue. Says that if he really wanted to end things, he wouldn't have come over, and instead slipped a note under his door telling him that the friendship was over because he is indeed a coward. Hearing this, his policeman hurls back with his fist, and Patrick closes his eyes anticipating his blow, but instead he hits himself and lets out a cry. After a minute of catching his breath, he asks for a drink. They sit and he asked how he lived the way he did, the lifestyle. And Patrick explained he just goes with the flow, though there's much more to it. His policeman throws him off when he mentions the idea of marriage to a woman, how he'd been thinking about it, and how people at his job had been asking him when he'd settled down. He asks Patrick had he ever thought of it, which he did, to a girl from his past named Alice. She just would have been a companion as a wife, though, nothing more. He had actually started seeing Michael while dating her. In the midst of thinking of this, it dawned on Patrick that his policeman was talking about the school teacher Marion, the one he can tell he has real feelings for. He reminds him that he wants to meet her, though secretly hoping that it never happens. November 14th, 1957. Patrick and his policeman go on a picnic, and for the first time, Patrick shows interest in him as a person, not as some specimen to take advantage of. He asks him to tell him everything of his parents, his siblings, but he's not in a talking mood and insists that Patrick tells him about himself instead. They share a moment while looking out at the sea, making plans to come back to swim together. Patrick promises to take him to the opera, movies, festivals, and everything else. So, adventure lies ahead for the two of them, or should I say the three of them. December 13th, 1957. His policeman finally brings the school teacher to the museum to meet Patrick. And y'all, Patrick was being a certified hater. Talking about she's not that cute, she's too tall, talked about her hair. Grinning from ear to ear because he felt like he had one up on her. When Marion recalled this day in her journal, I thought he liked her, but all the while, he was just being shady. You remember that nice little lunch they had? He purposely took them there, hoping it would be a turnoff for her. In the middle of his evil plotting, he decided it'd be better for him to stay on her good side. The more she trusted him, the more he could see his policeman, so he volunteered to take them to the opera. His treat, and assured his policeman he'd give him the details on their regular meet day, Tuesday, December 16th, 1957. Patrick is sound asleep and gets a knock at the door at 2 a.m. So, did you like her? His policeman stands there waiting for an answer. Groggy, Patrick insists that they drink some tea. His policeman steadily asks what he thought of Marion, and finally he answers, giving him what he wanted to hear. She's a supergirl and a lucky one. This is a relief. He couldn't imagine Patrick and Marion not getting along. But Patrick makes it clear that him liking Marion changes nothing for the two of them, for what, they had going on. And for the first time, his policeman spends the night. However, rushing out the door in the morning because work started at 6 and it's already 8. He's really big on being on time anyway. This day, Patrick sets out to work on cloud 9, finally awakened to his beautiful policeman, and that made his day. But it dawns on him that he doesn't know the next time he'll see him. So eager to know, he leaves work for an emergency meeting and finds his policeman at his job post. Irritated that Patrick has chosen the risky fate of showing up at his job after he was already late, his policeman yanks him by the collar into the police box. To lighten the mood, Patrick offers a gift, something he didn't even plan on doing. A pair of keys to his flat. So you can come by anytime you like, whether I'm home or not. With no response from his policeman, he starts to make a move on him, unbuttoning his shirt, to which his policeman asks one question: "Can you share me?" And Patrick responded, "If that's what it takes." And y'all, it got steamy again. Ooh. Part 3. We are again in Peace Haven, November of 1999. Marion is writing her letter to Patrick as they sit and watch the rain pour down. She couldn't help but think of her wedding day, as it rained that day as well, March 29th, 1958. She and Tom both were in a hurry to get the day over with, but in hindsight, she thinks Tom just wanted to do it before he changed his mind. Sylvie was now actually pregnant and not lying about it, and her husband Roy was thought to be the best man, but Patrick was instead. That caused issues amongst the family, but it was how Tom wanted it. Two things stood out about that day for Marion. Traditionally, someone on the force would wear their uniform at their wedding, but Tom wore a suit that Patrick bought for him, a gray suit, identical to the one Patrick wore in dark brown. And secondly, Patrick gave a speech at their reception, but what struck her was that he said she and Tom were the perfect civilized couple. The policeman and the teacher. Now, if that's not some sarcasm, I don't know what is. After his speech, he whispered something to Tom, kissed Marion on the hand, and left. The day before her wedding, she stayed over at Sylvie's. Sylvie asked her had she remembered what she told her about Tom years ago, about him not being like other men. Marion, of course, lied and said she didn't, to which Sylvie replied, "Good, I want you to forget about it. He must have changed, or we must have been wrong. We never thought he'd actually get married, but I'm glad you are." Awkward. They sat in silence for a while until Sylvie said they soon both would be married with kids of their own. Marion like, "Girl, you already irritating me talking about my man. Now you wishing pregnancy on me? When did you ever hear me bring up kids?" Well, those weren't her exact words, but that's what she wanted to say. Instead, she stood and told her she planned to keep working and kids were not a priority, made an excuse to leave, and she bounced. Her honeymoon didn't start off the way she had hoped. For starters, Tom's dad got them an old, dusty hotel room. She was hoping to spend some intimate time with her husband. They were newlyweds, for crying out loud. She felt like it was an unwritten rule, stay in the room the whole time and enjoy each other. But Tom insisted that they go to the pier and ride rides at the fairgrounds. There was this giant slide that finally made her feel close to Tom. He was terrified of heights, and they shared a mat, and the whole way down, he was holding on to her for dear life. She begged him to go again, but he was like, no, kissed her softly and demanded her to go back to the hotel with him. Y'all, my girl was on cloud 9. That's all she's been wanting. To feel close to him, to feel like he needed her. Unfortunately, that feeling didn't last long because later that night, when they went back to the room, Tom was like, it's time for bed, it's getting late. She's like, it's getting late. I know you ain't trying to go to sleep. But she crawled into bed and laid there wanting to get something started, but remaining coy. Then it happened. Tom made it happen. And she had one of her most joyous, disappointing moments ever. You see, it wasn't all that she thought it would be, but she was thankful to feel close to Tom. She wanted Patrick to know this in her letter so that he knew the tenderness they had, that though they failed, they did give it a try. Now, I must say, as she continues to write, there are some shocking revelations. She finally speaks again about Tom, who has been absent all of 1999. He's no longer a policeman, but a security guard. He and Marion don't talk, no longer sleep in the same bedroom, haven't for about 20 years. The reason being, he's an asshole. Well, that's not exactly what she said. She said that one day she asked him how did he spend his days, being as though he worked the night shift. And he responded, I meet strangers, sometimes we have drinks, sometimes we have sex. That's what I do, Marion. Please don't ask me about it again. I just, if that's not an asshole, I don't know what is. Marion had the nerve to say that a part of her was relieved by this because she knew she hadn't completely destroyed her husband. Like, girls, your wig squeezing your brain a little too tight, heifer. The heck does that mean? I find it interesting, though, that she said he liked to watch documentaries involving real-life crime, and it surprised her considering what happened. I'm like, girl, if you don't just tell us what happened, dragging it, making me anxious. She also noted that she was the one who insisted that Patrick come to live with them. Tom wanted no parts of it. But anyway, she continues to write about what happened on their honeymoon. Mr. Patrick Hazelwood weaseled himself into their plans. He offered his cottage to them. They would spend a few days alone, and then Patrick would join them to show them around. Patrick did his usual frenemy routine, pretending to be interested in Marion, including her in on all that he suggested. But things got heated when he brought up a controversial topic. Should mothers work? We know for one that Marion wasn't rushing to be a baby factory anytime soon, and she wanted to work, something Tom didn't agree with. Patrick found it amusing to see them go back and forth about it. He continued to agree with Marion on the matter, knowing it would make Tom upset. So finally, Tom called him out. What do you know about it? You know nothing about being a parent or being married. Patrick was like, and it's gonna stay that way. On the last day of their stay, they took a tour of Queen Victoria's vacation home. Marion was so consumed by the aesthetics that she hadn't even noticed Tom and Patrick had dipped off, and when she found them, they were standing close, face to face, looking intensely into each other's eyes. Patrick placed his hand on Tom's arm, and Tom closed his eyes and slowly opened his mouth. At least that's what she thinks she saw him do, but I'm just gonna leave that there. Back to Peace Haven, 1999. Like I said before, by this time, Marion had a normal routine with Patrick. She would regularly read to Patrick, but one day while reading Anna Karenina, she got teary-eyed when the subject of childbirth came up. She couldn't help but think of her own longing for kids. That was something she thought would bring she and Tom closer together, but it never came to pass. She also had a routine with Tom. They would eat together, have chit-chat about small stuff, nothing too heavy, watch a couple of programs on TV, and go their separate ways. Never talked about Patrick, even though he was just down the hall. Well, one day, Marion waited up for Tom, invited him to her bedroom, and told him that Patrick asked for him. Tom let out a sigh. He's had 2 major strokes, Marion. The doctor told us it's only a matter of time before another. The man can't talk. He'll never talk again. You're imagining things. And Marion's like, he just needs encouragement from you. Tom is like, the man is almost 80 years old. We've been through all of this before, and I don't know why you brought him here in the first place. Marion reiterates that Patrick needs him, to which Tom responds, he needed me years ago, and walked out of the room. Marion continued writing and recalled back to the summer after they were married. She and another teacher, Julia, took their class on a joint field trip. While eating lunch, Marion told her about the honeymoon and included the detail that she hadn't told anyone else, which was that Patrick had later joined them. Julia thought it was a bit weird and ended up asking her something she dreaded hearing. Isn't he homosexual? Marion froze up. She had always kind of suspected it, but never thought much into it because of what that could mean about his relationship with Tom. She decided to work up the courage to bring it up to Tom. Julia said something about Patrick today. She'd meant to say said something awful, but she was so angry and nervous she missed the word. Tom at first tried to deflect, but finally asked what she said. She said he was comme ça. Tom went pale, almost like he was in shock, but tried to mask it. What does that mean? You know what it means. No, I don't. Tell me, Marion. When she told him, he laughed and went on how the likes of those types of people, Patrick was nothing of the sort. He doesn't wear rouge on his face, flick his wrist, and walk how they do. He told her to check her friend before she got handled. Well, that's not exactly what he said, but he wanted to. Instead, he said, put her straight before she causes trouble. He then tried to drill it into Marion's head how ridiculous it was to think that. Marion was tired of him patronizing her, but promised to talk to her friend. That night, he gave her that good. something she had never experienced with him before. She said it felt like he meant it. Of course, Tom continued to see Patrick every other Saturday and Tuesday were his days to finish his portrait. Patrick would even come to the house sometimes, Thursdays rather, bringing wine and some interesting story to tell. He had finally been granted the chance to start the children's art event and invited Marion to bring her students. She only accepted the offer so that Tom would think everything was cool, but homegirl felt away. The day she took her students to the museum, she couldn't help but enjoy herself, there with the students and there with Patrick. She also adored that her students took to him, hanging on to his every word and having fun being creative. She tried to conceal her emotions. After all, this was Patrick. At the end of the day, she was reminded of that when he told her, "It's terribly good of you to let Tom come to Venice. I know he appreciates it." Marion was like, "Say what now?" Her kids were crying, ready to go home. One of them had even wet herself, but all Marion could hear was, "Good of you, Tom, Venice." She stormed out of the museum with her kids, leaving Patrick to clean up the puddle of urine on the floor. She went home that night furious. She started smashing dishes across the wall. She ripped Tom's clothing from the hangers, throwing all his things about, trying to find evidence of her suspicion. Tom comes home in shock of the kitchen, calling her name desperately, seeking that she's okay. And when he finally reaches her, she sat in the middle of the floor. She tried to think of an excuse, but couldn't, so she fell into his arms and cried. Finally, she said, You're going to Venice with Patrick? Why didn't you tell me?" Tom was like, "This is what this is all about," and proceeded to do the Tom thing to do, gaslight. He went on and on about how just because he didn't tell her right away, there's no reason to be upset, and how he needed to keep his freedom even though they're married. Asked her if she was jealous of him spending time with a friend. I mean, peak gaslighting. She said her reaction was because of what Julia said, and he cut her off, telling her they'd already settled it, and he was beginning to think she had a dirty mind. He told her not to bring it up again. She said nothing. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here reading like, girl, not you did all that and still didn't stand up for yourself. But anyways, she finally admits in her letter that she tried to remain blind to the relationship between Tom and Patrick. She even went out of her way to avoid Julia at work, but Julia caught up to her and asked her to join her for drinks. A truce for the awkward conversation they had about the honeymoon. Julia was the woman Marion wished she could be. The confidence, the drive, the freedom. Julia invited her to a political group meeting, and though she knew Tom would disapprove, she accepted. She actually rushed him off to Patrick so that she could attend. Now, it annoyed me that all the while she was there, all she could think of is how proud Patrick would be to see her at such an event. Like, are you serious right now? Anyways, she and Julia later went to the sea where she reminisced about the moment she had there with Tom. She'd wish she could tell Julia of everything that was going on, release everything that's been pent up, but instead she floated in the sea, mind racing with pain and confusion. Patrick sent her a postcard from Venice, gave her a full update of how the trip was going, only for Tom to write at the bottom, "Venice is okay, miss you." She immediately burned the card. She actually decided to take a trip to Venice herself, alone of course, as she and Tom didn't spend quality time together anymore, but while she was there, she couldn't help but thinking about how a woman in her early 60s found herself wondering about the city that her husband and his lover had once shared a romantic getaway. Her conclusion was that it was a sign that it was time for Patrick to be a part of their lives again. And I'm just thinking, no ma'am. But again, back to 1958. While Tom and Patrick were on their trip, she met up with Julia and Sylvie at their bar for drinks. Sylvie being Sylvie, going on and on about Roy and all of his flaws. So Julia was like, "So, why did you marry him?" And turns out she only married him because she liked him in bed. Roy came to walk Sylvie home, and Julia invited Marion to her place for even more drinks. As they walked through the park, the liquid courage kicked in, and Marion finally told Julia everything about Tom. And after all she said, Julia kept saying, "Poor Marion, poor Marion and told her he would never change. This was not the response she was looking for, and sis went off. He's my husband. I'm his wife, and all this lying he's doing, he's in the wrong. Then Julia told her something that I knew was coming ever since they first became friends. She said, if he's wrong, then that means I'm wrong. Marion like, what you mean? And Julia was like, gosh, Karen, you're so stupid. Well, that's not exactly what she said, but she wanted to. Instead, she just said, you really need to open your eyes. You're too bright not to. It's a waste. And she walked off while Marion stood there looking dumb. As the years went on, they mostly communicated through writing, she and Julia. Marion still had regrets for not being a better friend or having an open eye. And by the way her letter to Patrick has been going, I can only assume she's had regrets of what she did to him. She finally tells us what she did that was so bad. Still hungover from the night before with she and Julia, that liquid courage overcame her once again. She wrote a letter to Mr. Houghton. I think I've been saying his name wrong this whole time. Is it Houghton? I'm just say Houghton. Sorry. She wrote a letter to Mr. Houghton, Patrick's boss, anonymously, of course. She informed him that his employee, Patrick Hazelwood, was guilty of gross acts of indecency with other men, that she didn't think it'd be good to keep the children's art program going for safety and for a reputation of the museum. She dropped the note to Mr. Houghton into the mailbox without a second thought. Part 4. HMP Wormwood Scrubs, February 1959. Patrick writes from a freezing cold jail cell, searching for the words to say. He doesn't know where to start with his journal entry. He decided to start with his new prison friend, Bert. Bert is the reason he is even able to write in this journal. He's been looking out for him, and that he is grateful for because this journal distracts him from thinking about Tom. I find it interesting that this is the first time he mentions Tom by name. All this time he's been saying my policeman, the policeman. Well, I guess he said, well shoot, I'm already locked up. The worst is over. In the late of night, Patrick tells us how it all went down. At 1 a.m, there was an aggressive knock at his door. It couldn't be Tom because he had his own key, but to his surprise, it was 3 other police. Patrick Francis Hazelwood, I have a warrant here for your arrest on suspicion you committed acts of gross indecency with Lawrence Cedric Coleman. Patrick like, who? Police like, don't play dumb, you know. All Patrick could think was, this must be code for Tom, and they just didn't want to say his name, since he was police and all. Once at the station, they told him if he pleads guilty, it would make life a lot easier. But Lawrence Cedric Coleman was not the code name for Tom. He was actually the guy he met at the Argyle a year or so prior. The one he started to do something with, but nothing came out of it. Patrick at first was going to fight the charge until Officer Slater alluded to families and friends being affected by things like this, when it all can be avoided. Patrick then thought he had to be talking about Tom, and out of fear something would happen to him, he lied and said he did have relations with Lawrence. During his stay in prison, he was granted a visit with a psychiatrist whose purpose was to help cure him of his indecent behaviors. Patrick was like, child, if you don't go on somewhere with that, but hey, if it allows me to get out of my cell and spend time in this cozy office once a week, I'll go along with this ridiculous notion. But during the first session, Dr. Russell saw right through him. He told him he could care less of what adults did in their private time, but it would be a waste of time for him coming to the sessions knowing that he didn't want to be cured. He was really nice about it though, and Patrick agreed that the cure therapy would be a waste. 13 weeks in, he had grown accustomed to the prison life, the lack of having a life, that is. And all the while, as much as he tried not to think of Tom, he couldn't help but do so. About their time in Venice, they were able to walk arm in arm, even kiss in public without so much as a glance in their direction. Patrick wanted to move there. Tom said they should fly to the moon. Patrick pleaded with Tom that they should just not return to England. Tom said they couldn't stay because they both had good jobs, family, and friends back home. Not to mention, he didn't speak Italian, but he never once mentioned Marion or the fact that he was a married man. Patrick delighted in that. During his trial, he had to have a female witness, someone either unmarried or of a certain stature, like a school teacher. The only person he had was Marion. Tom always told him that she knew nothing of their relationship, even even though Patrick felt she was too smart to not have figured something. On the witness stand, Patrick could tell she was nervous, but she tried her best to combat what the prosecution was throwing at her. He read a passage from Patrick's journal, the one where he exclaims about Tom showing up at the museum unannounced. Mr. Jones, the lawyer, asked Marion, "Mrs. Burgess, who is my policeman?" I have no idea. Mr. Jones was like, "Oh, okay," and read another passage. This time, the one where he describes meeting Marion for the first time and the three of them having lunch. Mr. Jones asked, "Mrs. Burgess, who is the school teacher?" She didn't respond. He went on to say that there was a lot in the journal, but he would spare the court of the details. Asked her where all this information came from, to where she responded, "I don't know, perhaps some fantasy of his." There's an awful lot of details for fantasy. Mr. Hazelwood is a very imaginative man. He tried to get her to agree that something was going on between Patrick and her husband, but she never folded. Marion later visited Patrick in prison. He had hoped for Tom to show up instead, or at least come with her. Shady Patrick couldn't help but throw shots at her, saying that all the effort that she... This was funny, I'm sorry. Saying that all the effort she put into her makeup, it wasn't any better off than the queens in prison, and all they had was flour and paint. Like, sir, was that necessary? But anyways, Marion tried to make small talk, asked him how they treated him in there, how was the food, and Patrick snapped. "For God's sakes, Marion, tell me about Tom. How is he?" She told him that he was good, and he decided to leave the force before they fired him and became a security guard. Tom didn't know that Marion had went to visit Patrick, and she wanted to keep it that way. As she gathered her belongings to leave, Patrick grabbed her arm rather aggressively, begging her to ask Tom to come. She said she'd ask, but he won't come. Patrick spent his days thinking about nothing but Tom. He didn't even want to discuss anything else but Tom. His prison buddy, Bert, had a good deal worked out with him. He'd protect him as long as Patrick told him stories, like the likes of Shakespeare. This day, he decided to tell a new story about a policeman named Tom who had a problem, and the problem was that he was queer and in love with an older man. The more Patrick told his love story with Tom, the more angry Bert grew. He wanted no parts of even hearing about such a thing. As he grew angry, so did the crowd. Patrick just kept crying out how much they loved each other, and as he did, he was met with blows to the face, back, and stomach. On the ground, he laid, imagining the day Tom was at his apartment upset at him because he lied about the portrait and his intentions. He imagined that Tom was the one who was beating him. He took each blow, saying his name, until he became numb. Part 5. Peace Haven, December 1999. A home doctor's visit proves that Patrick needs more professional help from a nursing home, perhaps. There's been no improvement in his condition, and the doctor believes he may have had a third stroke. Marion, for some reason, insists on him staying with her. Maybe she feels bad for sending him to prison. Maybe she has high hopes that he will fully recover, or maybe she just hopes that Tom finally breaks and talks to him. Either way, I don't get it. Like, girl, the doctor is telling you you're not equipped. Let it go. But anyways, she continues to write, this time catching us up on what happened after she mailed the infamous letter. She'd awakened fully clothed to Tom standing over her, back from his trip to Venice. She couldn't really recall the night, only that she had went out with Sylvie and they got in late. Tom didn't seem much interested, just happy that she was okay and still joyful from his trip, which he and Marion had still, to this day, never discussed. She waited for weeks to see what would come of her letter. Maybe it got lost in the mail, she thought. Maybe Mr. Houghton decided not to do anything with the information. She left it alone. Back at work, she braced herself for Julia. She had no idea how to get things back on track, but she trusted that their friendship would be mended, and anything concerning Julia's private life would be forgotten. As soon as she got to work, Julia was sitting on her desk. Before she could even say anything, Julia told her that she got a new job and she'd be moving to Norwood. She had been wanting to do so for some time, and now was her chance. Marion's only concern was making sure she knew she was sorry about the night before, which she graciously accepted her apology. Later that night, Marion prepared dinner and sat waiting for her husband to return home from work. He would normally be there around 8, but as the night grew, she assumed it was just an eventful day at work. After all, he was a cop. There was no telling what the day might bring. But the next morning, still no Tom. In a panic, she raced out of the door and headed for the police station. Then she decided against that because she didn't feel like hearing Tom's complaints of her causing a scene over nothing. She started towards his mom's house, but almost instinctively kept going. She was headed to Patrick's. That's where her husband was. She knew it. She couldn't wait to catch the two of them together. She couldn't wait to see the expressions on their faces. She even imagined smacking Tom, and just the thought of it excited her. She ran faster and faster, hit the buzzer multiple times once she reached the door. They're inside, ignoring me because they know it's me. Who else could it be at this time in the morning? She rang the bell more and started banging on the door, and finally it opened. But it wasn't Tom or Patrick. It was a man she had never seen before. "Who are you?" Graham Vaughn, top floor flat, very awake and rather annoyed. Without hesitation, he told her that Patrick wasn't home. She asked him how he knew. He told her the cops came and got him last night. He added that they all knew he was queer and that so many were in that particular neighborhood, but it was a shame how brutal the country was. Marion then went to Sylvie to break the news and to confide in her what she had done. Sylvie was shocked of learning that Patrick was arrested, but not that he was involved with Tom. After all, he was her brother, and she had said things throughout the years, but Marion being Marion, it would go over her head, or she chose to ignore it. Sylvie promised to keep her secret of writing the letter, the same way Marion never told that she trapped Roy with that fake pregnancy. Later, after a long, dreadful day of work, she arrived home to see Tom already there. Before she could even get in the door, he was on his feet telling her that Patrick had got arrested. She told him that she knew because after he didn't come home, she went to Patrick's place looking for him. Tom had so much anger. He started throwing wooden chairs around, breaking them to pieces, groaning in anguish. Then he finally said, I was there when they brought him in. I saw him, Marion. Slater brought him in by the wrist, and I got out of there as quickly as I could. I couldn't let him see me. Marion, until that moment, had never thought about the possibility of hurting Tom in her quest of destroying Patrick. The conversation that followed kind of surprised me. Tom finally admitted his relationship with Patrick. Well, kind of. He asked what he should do because he feared with Patrick going to prison, they would find out about everything and he would be ruined. And to my surprise, instead of basking in the joy of catching Tom red-handed, Marion carried the conversation as if his secret love life was something they openly discussed. She assured him that he wouldn't be ruined because Patrick would never tell on him and she would never leave him. Tom cried for weeks on end after that, even in his sleep. And Marion knew that the love she had hoped for would never be, that his body was with her, having conversations, eating dinner, etc. But his spirit, his heart, was elsewhere. In that December of 1999, Marion made one last attempt at righting her wrongs, and she started out to do this with a lie. She told Tom that Patrick didn't have long to live according to the doctor. Tom's like, yeah, that's nothing new. We already knew that. Let's put him in a nursing home. She told him that it was too late to do all of that he had only a week left, if that, and that he had to talk to him. Tom was slightly open to the idea, but said he didn't know what to say to him. Marion told him she wrote something, and Tom went ballistic. He accused her of wanting to rub everything in their faces, of this being her final seed of revenge at his hand. One last go at the old man before he died. He grabbed her up, shook her, yelling that Patrick had been punished enough, that he had been punished enough. Marion, despite Tom's anger, responded calmly. She said it was not about anyone's wrongs but her own, that She wanted to confess everything to them both. Tom said he would think about reading it, but made no promises. The next day, abnormally cheerful to get out of bed, Marion got on with her day as she normally would, tending to Patrick. She heard Tom downstairs putting the kettle on, which normally after his morning swim, she wouldn't see him for the rest of the day, so she knew exactly what that meant. She joined him for a cup of tea, neither of them saying a word to each other. After she finished, she grabbed her manuscript, as she called it, because it was far too long to call it a letter at this point, and sat it on the table. She went to her bedroom and could hear Tom's voice faintly reading what she had wrote. She began to pack a bag, just the bare essentials, as she was sure Tom would have no problem with sending the rest of her belongings. Her time in Peace Haven had come to an end. Where might she go? She didn't know. Starting with a visit to Norwood seemed good. Catch up with Julia and hear a story other than her own. Before she left, she peeked in on Tom and Patrick. Patrick, who would have normally been asleep at this time, had his eyes glued to Tom, hanging on to his every word. She turned the lamp on them, exiting quietly, leaving them to be together. Whew. What a whirlwind. I'm not so sure that I gave a good reading to you guys though, because it was kind of, jumping back and forth with the back in the day and then present time, and I don't know if I gave that like a good go, but hopefully you didn't get confused. Really feel like Harry, Emma, and David have big shoes to fill, because Miss Roberts was playing no games when she wrote this one. I mean, it's gripping from start to finish. Couple of things I wanted to note. I think it's interesting that Mr. Harry Styles has chosen another film that is set in the 50s. I also find it interesting that both Don't Worry Darling and My Policeman, though he's the main character, neither film is told from his character's perspective. I just knew the last journal entry was going to be from Tom, but that didn't happen. I really hope they expand the role of the older Patrick, only because Rupert Everett is everything, and it would be a shame for him to be on screen with no lines. Like, come on. Overall, I'm really excited to see the film and what everyone brings to it, but I do have a confession. I'm so disappointed because I don't like none of the main characters. Okay, I'll say this. It's gonna be too much for me to go into, but I'll explain. Maybe once the movie comes out, I'll have a different perspective. But right now, it's like, oh my God, no. Let me know down in the comments how you feel about the novel, if you have read it, and what scene are you looking forward to seeing the most. If you haven't done so already, be sure to like this video and hop on over to that subscribe button and hit the bell. Otherwise, YouTube will never show you my videos. As always, I'm all ears. Until next time, bye. Old age, mostly. She still lives in the childhood. I cannot talk. Okay. I can't talk. Oh God.